Dunga say that Diki Tablam Dolia, then Sugi, that Tablam Yasho de Danga to Simi Dene, and Diki Truviata, and Dunga say Tablam did and to Samnatanji to Winza, then to the Dikoria, Samnonalia, and the Semitone, Diki Trupta, Ganstrukoria, Dunga Seta, Ganstruk, Sehori, said Dikoria, to the and that, so Diko Sugorva.
Good morning. Amongst the varying techniques to achieve happiness and eliminate suffering, the very best is to transform our way of thinking. In order to be able to transform one's way of thinking, one needs to understand the mind, understand ourselves particularly well, also understanding the causes for happiness and the causes that will lead to suffering, and how to cultivate and eliminate these respective causes.
Dunga Seyalia, Dunga Diki Tambo, Chimeva Suela, and Dunga Diki Chasa, Tambo washing boy, Rimba Chiche, Dunga washing aje, and Dunga Yoyagi, Judica Res, Ganasuri Gungures, a Judipa, sometime, Chik Yontadia, Hawache. Na Dunga Seche, Dunga Timeva Suelia, and the Samlutone, and Chike, the Shin of the Dunga Yonde, Dunga de Carres. Dunga Yonde Simit and the Samlutone Kanaka Yungure Saji, Ting Yonda de Pache. Some Dene, that Dunga de Meva Suela Yang, Samlutaje, Samlutone, Dunga de Kanase, who say Tablam Kanachi or recipe, Dijimbating on the Hawaii, Digor on the Jantor Shadi, Jigorwada.
In order to be able to eliminate suffering, one first needs to know what suffering is and its causes. In addition to this, one needs to come to recognize how suffering arises in our minds, how it appears to our mind. And this we need to train in.
Dunga de Karimura Selang, Dunga de Dunga said and Juve, Dunga Chava Tuji, Dunga Sachi, Dunga Risum Che, Murua, Satis Dunga Lagre Sache. Dina the young Dunga and Juve Dunga said that Karel Tendigos, so long as you Pumbo Sugi Pumbuit and the Leomurua, Benanga Dunga Monche, Karel House, and some the Migi Tonche, Denegate on any other Dunga de Chiche. Young Amjugi Goshen and Chikanga Chiche. Then the Lugi Rachadang and Denigitone and Dunga Chiche, that Jimata, Roda, Denigitone, Guje, that each other one bullet in Ligro, one body on the Lugina Chadro, Tisula one body, then the Yigi, Samletone, and as Dungate, Dunga di Yumur, what is that? Dunga de Yumuduas. Di Dunga di Guzo, the Carsano, Dendi, Pumbo de Ligwas, and Tesanga to Lugi Pumbo. Dio di Pumbo de Caratin Ligors and Judy and Lela in the Yumur, Lela, Yawanga make Lea Carasana, Dilatin Tukures. The lady can assume Gurias, Dicuno, Yomo, Mari, Yomo, but then Ligores, Pentuasha, Conro, Yomola Sopa, Dilatin Ligores. Yomo de Caratin Ligores in it, Titavi the Tassin, Tinsin, Maripa said, Delatin Ligores, I think on to Dungayo, Gushin body, next to the Tinecherua.
To understand suffering well, one investigates it through the varying divisions, the most common of which is the threefold division, into the suffering of physical and mental pain, the suffering of transient happiness, and all-pervasive suffering. So of these three, the first two, suffering of physical mental pain and the suffering of transient happiness, arise in dependence on our physical and mental aggregates. So what does that mean? Our suffering arises in dependence on our physical and mental aggregates. Well, it can arise in dependence on suffering, or can arise in dependence on, for example, our sense powers. We see something, and in dependence on that, suffering arises. Or we hear something, and in dependence on that, suffering arises. Or we taste or smell something, or something touches our body. In dependence on that, suffering arises. But not only in dependence on our sense consciousnesses, but also our mental consciousnesses. So here, in this way, independence on our physical and mental aggregates, suffering arises. But then, what is the cause for these contaminated physical and mental aggregates? Well, they have come about in dependence on contaminated karma accumulated in previous lives. And what's the cause of that contaminated karma? It was accumulated in dependence on our afflicted minds. And our afflicted minds, they came about in dependence on their root cause, the ignorance of self-grasping.
Hina da kare nganzo kare taplong yorsan de maung bana de niki lui di malong ya maya da di dan gyudi meba soya ki tablam di samtang kor jesa da nganzo dunga le tarya ki gyu nyomong ba di dunga ya meba soya la da samlo kare tang samlo thone kanis meba soya kore ya la de da nganzo dangbo dunga di rikti hako wa di ge chimbore jesa hako yo da di dunga le meba soya gudu sempeke samlo le dunga de la tar gudu sempe samlo ge di niba che kore 탈두게 삼바스 니바지오 다 타고도 선배 삼다데 간스 타고래서 삼다베네 당한 주기야 될래야 아니 지게 수름송이 되리 아주 될 가서래 류가 있으면 거네 예주에 덤지 수름송이다 안도스전에 수름송 깨와치 말이야 수름송이야 안디메제 당한 도스전에 셰바나 잠바다 이제 잠제 고미야 제가 수rim소야 류가 있으면 예주에 덤베 수rim소야다 잠제 공부이나 체델아야나 아주 디기 연구래 마오바이네 동아야게 길이 바지지 디기 줍도 거와 디삼다 잠제 공 근데 잠제 삼다네 안데네 아지네 아니 그래서 샘제 탐제게 동아다 안직 바 샘제 탐제를 디기 줍제 샘제 동아 세긴 세배 소수 지구 살 많이 바자 샘제 탐지기 동아 세긴 세배 하삼께다 대인자다 다 뒤져야야 안심제 탐지구도는 사유고방 토부도 세배게 당한 쪽에 장슈 샘께야래 다 샘께네 되는 근데 냠는 제에 가르스네 진배년을 추진년을 죄배년 존재년을 삼대 시라기 냠는데 냠는 디시고 그래서 디나데 조 당아주 녀모베 자와 계게 다세 마리바디 매바서야라 아니 동방이 되베 시라 곰제네 디메바서 고고래 에서지 당한 저게 다 누가 여기 규념 뭐 매바서 다 림바디 데디제
In terms of the suffering that we experience in dependence on this body, the solution to that is not to destroy our body. We cannot sustain this life if we were to destroy this body, and this is because the cause that led to the attainment of this body has ripened. So we cannot now eradicate what has this ripening result, because it is fully ripened. However, we can have a direct impact on the body that we attain in our future lives. How so? Here, we need to first, as I mentioned in the previous segment, come to know suffering, understand and recognize suffering well as its causes. Recognizing suffering and its causes well will naturally lead to the wish arising to attain liberation from suffering and the causes that leads to it. And having independence on giving rise to the wish to be freed of suffering and its causes will lead us to investigate and cultivate the method that will lead to liberation. And the method is, in particular, ethical restraint. Ethical restraint of our body, speech and mind. And in addition to this, cultivating love and compassion. So restraining our mind so that it's not under the influence of the afflictions, and thereby our physical behavior and our verbal speech is also restrained, is a practice of ethics. And conjoining this with love and compassion will ensure not only that we are accumulating causes that lead to happiness in our future lives, but also that we will experience happiness in this very life. Then in addition to this, the cultivation of the minds of love and compassion, the wish for others to be happy and the wish for others to be freed of suffering, this we need to take further. We need to develop this further to the point where we take individual responsibility for others attaining a state of lasting happiness and eradicating all suffering. In other words, we need to develop the altruistic attitude of universal responsibility. And then we need to develop that one step further through the recognition that the only way that we can skillfully guide each and every being to enlightenment is to be an enlightened being. In this way, we generate bodhicitta, the mind of enlightenment, the mind that is determined to become a Buddha for the sake of others. And in addition to that, we also need to eradicate the root cause of our suffering, the root cause that keeps us bound in samsara and impedes our spiritual development and prevents the attainment of enlightenment, the ignorance of self-grasping. So therefore, motivated by bodhicitta, with a foundation of a restrained, a subdued, a tamed mind, we strive to cultivate the wisdom realizing emptiness so that we can become a Buddha for the sake of others. So these are the stages that we need to train in order to eradicate suffering, not just from our continuum, but through eradicating it on our continuum, we'll become a skilled guide, a guide who can lead others, guide others to achieve the same state themselves.
방지 릭니서 뇽모베 릭 가서 둥아요에 규진반에서 하고에 직제 당한 저게 삼로 규와 다제 냠는 제기 림바 니제 딘림바 이다 하고 왔지 뇽모바 둥아요에 규 뇽모바다 딘이기 림바 주하다 림바 직제 디진이 셰상 림바 직제 다디 나서 삼레 때네 디 뇽모바들에 타야기 빠야기 냠는 제기 림바 치 림바 니제 디진이 셰상 니들이 대 하고와 잠이 지고 말 당한 저게 다 뇽모바 용하기 림베 용하디 림바디 하고와 좀 이거고 인지미지 야네 공고해서 말아 다 아주게 람 냠내지기 림바디 하고와 좀 마디바제 디 야네야도 곰나마도 야 야네는 하고나야 아니 야네는 마곰바이나 셈디 니베침보 야기 로투요 말아 베네 아주게 잠제 공고래 사다 잠제 공되네 아니 자주 셈 공고래 되네 파진도 냠는 공고를 된 동방이 또 공고를 해야 되는바디 디티제고서 하고 사셔 이나다 하고는 잠재 마고 바이나 공고를 선배 하고 거되네 잠재 마고 바는 수수규라 잠재로 줘요 잠바다 저월로 요랑 아주 이나 마고 바이는 야 누가 쳐다 쳐주고 말 진짜 공바이는 단 잠재 당부 공고가 하고 공고비 김천다 하고 처외 제리야 된 잠재는 아주 야네야노 삼다지 아니 공고거래 그래서 공바이나 다디 공르디 야 누버 셔셔주고 그러와 디나시 심제 탐지기도 산유고방 토벌 쇼어스 배 장주 셈사디 공고와 하고 제 다디니 디네 토벌 쇼어스 배 삼 야네야도 다죠 공고거와 공바이나 디네 로디야 누버 셔주고 그래 디나시 다 제리야 동방이 따와서야디 디네시 하고 디네 하고네 딘 동방이 따와대야 야네 야노 삼당고 그래 디 삼다베는 저기 누바 셔셔도 저도 그래서 당부 람냠리지 림바데 하고 와자 하고 전에 디네고야 맞아 곰세데 야네 야도 봐 제시도 삼다지 도시네 곰고야 돼 차고 그래서 다 림바데 디네 차고 와다
What I've just summarized in the previous segment needs to be understood well. It needs to be understood that there are these two pathways. There's the path that leads to ongoing suffering through the cultivation of the causes, through the afflictions that will ripen into further suffering. And there's the pathway that leads to freedom from that. the cultivation of the causes that lead to liberation from suffering, a state of lasting peace. So there are these two pathways, and they need to be understood well. But mere knowledge is insufficient. No matter how educated one is, no matter how eloquently one can explain it, that alone is insufficient. To be very clear, knowledge is indispensable, and the more thorough one's knowledge, the greater the chances of liberation are, or the faster that the liberation will be attained. However, mere knowledge is insufficient. Mere knowledge is insufficient. We need to cultivate the path of wisdom and compassion. So therefore, one explicitly needs to meditate on one's knowledge. And these two are done together. As one cultivates knowledge, that knowledge needs to be integrated through an ongoing process of reflection. So no matter how well one knows the various stages of the meditations that will eventually lead to bodhicitta, that knowledge alone will not lead to one even becoming a gentler person, a kinder person. That knowledge needs to be integrated through reflection. And likewise, no matter how proficient one is in the philosophical points that would lead to the understanding of reality, reality will not be understood without repeated reflection. So therefore, in order to open our minds and transform our heart, this knowledge needs to be continuously cultivated and integrated.
어디디 공고야디 나 가서 상마 지와리다 나라이네 공가이네 공고를 경험지나 공하셔서 수이네 때 먹음네 이야기 되면은 이네 단디니기 아즈리아 지게 따다로 용마도 하다 지려가를 아지게 두세 다고라 먹어다 디네 지금 연구로가 레로를 디네 저티네.
What I've just presented now is the case for each and every person here, yourselves and myself as well. The knowledge that we have cannot be left at mere words. So life is busy. There are many distractions, many activities that draw us, as well as inner distractions such as laziness, not feeling like it, and feeling that we should rather do other things first. So this is the situation we find ourselves in.
아당이는 막 공부를 해서 마시셔야 나랑 공부 경험을 공부를 드셔야 되는 말 당아 지나서 차산직 바래.
I need to say that explicitly because I do not want to give the false impression that you need to engage in meditation. Someone like me, I don't need to. This is completely not true. This is something we all need to engage in.
아데네게 나가서 동방에 또 별로 공부를 생활 중에 동아용석에 또 녀모용석에 또 규다센세의 마릭바스 다센 마릭바리 디메 메바스요 그래 디메바스의 녀보데다 동방에 또 별로 들이 디 공부를 에서시 시고라다 디 공부를 에서 나디 공부에는 동방이 세야 되가는 시에서다 동방이 삼다에 들려야 맞으다 또 아주 나베 좀더 텐지부 것이에요. 또 동방이 세야 되가는 시라 그래서네 동바 라도 현다지 많이 봐서 고고래 현다지 많이 봐서 고고래 동바라이래 제가 가르 말에 시거든 말에 가르에서는 강라야 마디오 바랑은 원이 줍도 괜지 데네지 말 매바질라 동바이 시거래 세로와 제가 강라야 마디오 바랑은 원이 줍어디 요래요 말에서는 요 말에서 자 최근에시네 강라야 마디오 랑 원이 줍어 동바래서 랑 원이 마두바래 되어서 지난 강라야 마도 랑원에 마주바디 동반이 세계에서 랑동 지난 내 하고 외로디 내 똑베 로디 니 안에야 공부를 했어.
As I've presented again this morning, the root cause of every experience of suffering, no matter whether it's slight or coarse, is our ignorance of self-grasping. That is the root cause of all pain and misery. And its antidote is the wisdom realizing emptiness. So what is this emptiness that wisdom comes to realize? Well, according to Prasangika, the highest, the most subtle explanation in Buddhism is that emptiness is the absence of something, empty of something, an absence of something. And what is empty? Is the phenomenon empty of? What is it absent of? Well, this can be expressed in different synonymous ways. The phenomenon can be empty of being established by way of its own essence, empty of being established by way of its own nature, empty of being established by way of its own defining characteristics. This needs to be understood and then reflected on, cultivated on, again and again, recognizing that whatever we are thinking about, every object of thought, does not exist by way of its own nature, essence, or characteristics, but is empty of existing in this way.
나 강라에 마도 랑원은 주바데 요 말에데 만조 로려야 나유도 되는 거래 강라에 랑원도 주바 능거 취해 가는 나베네 강라에 마도 랑원 주바 능거래 나유도 만조 로 한gel이야 나와 나신 강라에 랑원도 주바 요래 선배 짐바충 거래 지 짐벨로들라 다진 텐신 마리 바시 거다 아주 녀모바게 얘기 자외 규디 디차들 그래서 강라에 마도 랑원도 주바 요래 선배로디 녀모바게 얘기 자외 규 텐신 대인자 아주 강라마도 랑원을 두바도 요 말에 선배 삼는데다 요래 선배 논이디 가다 따다 책으로 와 세상 아주 강라마도 랑원을 두비 똥발에 선배 똥발에 선배 로디 같이 숙체 주변에 강라마도 랑원을 두바도 요래 선배 로디 마 숙충충 주로 와 세상 디니시 진행 아주 녀모밖에 제위기 되면서 다 두스고 그래지로 와
The realization of emptiness is that phenomena are empty of existing by way of their own essence or nature or characteristics. But this is not how phenomena appear to us. Whatever the object of thought is, it appears to us as being independent, as being self-existent, existing by way of its own essence, nature, or characteristics. That is how every object of thought, everything we think, appears to us in this way. And then, not only do objects appear to us in this way, but an innate mind grasps at it as existing in the way that it appears. Innately, without thinking, in an uncontrived way, innately, we grasp at the object that we are thinking about as existing in the way it appears. And that consciousness that grasps in this way is called the ignorance of true grasping, or if the object is the I, the self, that same consciousness is called the ignorance of self-grasping. So this consciousness that grasps at a phenomenon as existing in the way that it appears is clearly contrary to the consciousness that realizes that phenomena do not exist in the way they appear. And this is what we need to meditate on repeatedly over a sustained period. And we can relate to this through the thinking of a scale, that on one side now there's a heavy weight that we've accumulated, a weight of habituation that we've accumulated since beginningless time, of believing that phenomena exist in the way they appear. But as we meditate ever more on reality, recognizing that phenomena are empty of existing the way they appear, on that other side of the scale, we add more weight. And in this way, as we add more wisdom, the side of the afflictions weaken. And as we add ever more wisdom, the impact that the afflictions have on our way of thinking and relating to the world and others starts to change. So this process of repeated reflection based on ever-growing knowledge, is how we eradicate the afflictions, in particular through eradicating the root cause, the ignorance of self-grasping.
Kangba chil samdana yakbo yorbe, yang shani mi shenda chil samdana yakbo yorbe, tazi rangla samdana yakbo yorbe, kari gomi gombu re se de, ta tangbo gomya de nga su sosi tsa, nga se, sosi tendo gombu re je re. Chizang tangbo de nga se de, nga soso nga se de, ane gangla ima do rangwen de tubi, nga rangwen de tubi tongpa re se, de jeba che che, tangbo nga khorong le, rangwen de tubi tu, tugu mi du, tenji ke namsha samda jeba che, dene jeba che, nga se de, ta gangla ima do rangwen de tubi zawa gini re mindo sembe, rangwen de tubi tongpa nyi di, nga se de soso ki tendo gombu re, so tangbo nyamlen chi dui kabla.
Every object of thought, everything we think about, appears as being inherently existent, but in reality is empty of inherent existence. So whether the phenomenon is something of the class of form, something speech, or something that we see or taste, or it's another, the consciousness is, the object is a consciousness, or a person, a self, whatever that object is, it appears to us as being self-existent, when it is actually empty of existing in this way. So amongst the vast array of objects, what is the very best to engage in our meditation on? Should we start with a material phenomenon, such as a house or a tree? Should we start with a consciousness or a person other than ourselves? Or should we start with oneself? So here the texts are clear. We should start with oneself, our own self. This is our starting point. And of the varying techniques, the most skillful, the most impactful is the presentation on dependent arising, to come to recognize that the self, our self, is empty of self-existence, but is merely dependent arising.
Dabo nga se di tendo gomgo be gyumse karasine nga zuge lag khara cheben dabo nga se be samde le nguru wa chis chisa nga se samle de nga ra shin tu ba chimbe samde ligo re chisa de nga yi tendo nga zu gomba nga se de rang mun tu be tong ba sam tang de nga ra shin tu ba chimbe chimba di ni ba chung tu re ndi chung ro na di ji nga zu le nyomo ji go ma re nyomo ji tu go ma re di za da dabo nga se be di tendo gomgo re se gyumse ro di che go re wa.
The reason that we are so explicitly and repeatedly encouraged to start with the self is because every thought that we have has as its foundation the self, our self. That is the foundation, the basis of all our thought processes. So if we can, to the extent that we can weaken grasping at the self as being self-existent, to that extent we will weaken all the afflictions that result from the self-grasping.
참못 차도 될이야 뢰파 따바 좀 차고 제가 누진 뭐그다 가슴 질량 하세야디 이기 넘버 10에 참못 될바 따 좀세디 두 제바치네 근데 이기 넘버 10에 참못 코롱데도 동반이 근데 이기 넘버 10에 참못 코롱기 아주길이 뉴스 뉴메 셈세 이기 좀 차쇼지리고래 근데 이기 넘버 10 참못 코롱게 때도 코롱게 동반이 원숨도 또 동반이 또야 곰 근데 코롱게 동반이 또대 곰제네 동방이 무슨 또 소바 이게 남바시바 참고 코롱기 코롱 라신이 마두바디 무슨도 또 봐이나 또 소바이나 되네 동이 또 별로 약쇼들에다 근데 귤에 끼투베이나 Then sang ye, Jobo sang ye to go, Taran Jobo, Unibo Mare. New sim. You some treasures order, some treasures de la. The number some treasure jorua. Digi treasure digi, Dongbani Korongi Tendo, Koron Hasi Madubo. Then it to below the Dambo, Denjisu Dogua, Toparwa, Digelia Koron Gomchin, don't you awesome to below more Jura, and then you do, then it, Desig Korongi Koron Dongbani Topi Logi. Don't eat in the Shini Jubaina, that don't wants to be look you so then Sangelia, your book Sange to go regile.
In the presentation of the Prasangika, the I is merely imputed by mind onto the subtlest mental consciousness. Mental consciousnesses, as I mentioned last night, have a vast degree of subtlety. And on the very subtlest mental consciousness, this is what the I is imputed on. This is the basis of labeling or the basis of imputation. And the I is labeled or imputed onto this subtle mental consciousness. So this is what we eventually need to come to recognize is empty of inherent existence, empty of existing by way of its own nature. And when we realize that this subtlest of mental consciousnesses is empty of inherent existence, this is the supreme object to realize as empty. And when one does actually realize that the subtle, innate mind is empty of inherent existence, Buddhahood will quickly be attained.
Zanda denigi to Tombani say, Doeg, Lord, the Tasha de Tinubiche, Deni and Zada, Delia, and the Jig, Jumta Sosorangi Duetan, that got the Mambu Giovanza, that the Kasan Juvana Jire, Denimada, Dimatsitin Maloshana, Kasadinma, the Casaleva in Sejorwa, the Casaleva, Bene, Chiviki, near Dita, Lu, Mamimba Nam, and Cheddar Cluvi, Yangacho, Resident, Cokomrich, Chebachi, Shimjuji, Loya, Goroji, Yahako, Mamagovena, Lamsa, Jike, Tinubi Tower, the Samdavana, Chedaki, Yangachimu, research.
According then to the supreme philosophical school, the Prasangika, this innate, subtlest of mental consciousnesses is the basis of labeling for the self. The other Buddhist philosophical tenets have a different view, their own presentation of the basis upon which, the basis or the illustration for the self. So returning to the text, in the second paragraph on page 17, we concluded last night with the sentence, there is a grave danger that because of this subtle point, those of immature intelligence might fall into the view of nihilism. So in other words, those who hold the doubts as expressed in the question, if they hold those doubts and have immature intelligence, in other words, they are not well educated in Buddhist philosophy, there is the danger they may fall into the extreme of nihilism, believing that nothing exists at all.
Dini Zada, Cheda Malhuege, Tablamlia, Jubi, Tapsu, or Tapsu, and the Reshik said the Negapring Lagore. Jubi, Tapsu, Reshik Ladu, Talk Cheda, the Malhumbe, Taplia, and Negapringlia, and the Tenupe Tawa, the Doma Tubiki, Negaptelia, and the Garsungo Tapli, Garimursen, Takueki is Umar Ranguba, Latenji, Yapseki, and the Garsungore said that Dombani said the Duendale. Dombani said the country lagors in a Lunumela, Nai Wonki Shaba, my imber, Mimber, Urangi, Tumomambi, Dulu Yungwene, Dupe, Ribi, Guayang. And the Tanyedu, Rang Chen Nam, Rang Ngoni, Duba Shaki, yes.
continuing in the text, just to say for those here, I've slightly changed the translation in the first paragraph. For those watching online, the version on the website has been updated. So therefore, to guard against this through skillful means. So here His Holiness writes that these great teachers of the Buddhist tradition, in dependence on the actual sutra teachings of the Buddha, have presented the self in varying ways in accordance with the varying dispositions of students. So looking at the first points, the Svatantika Madhyamika Bhavavivyeka and his spiritual sons use reasoning to refute that phenomena exist from the point of view of their own unique way of existing and without being posited due to appearing to a faultless awareness. So I'll read this, the change again. The Svatantika Madhyamika Bhavavivyeka and his spiritual sons use reasoning to refute that phenomena exist from the point of view of their own unique way of existing and without being posited due to appearing to a faultless awareness.
And the Jinyalangan Tenjubike Tongba is a kind of Sheswan, Che Tam Rangun when you to be a Tongba, the Rangun and Matuba till Tongba in Sherwada. Isn't that is Delia, that Umar Rangi Bigi, Tongba you don't have Shigorda, Tongba said, Tongba said. Karasi Uma Rangi by Latenji, Yapseki said, Tongba Ni said, Tanga to get Tenjubi Tongba Ni, Gata Garrison, Rangun Jubadi loves Rangun Jubat. Che Tam Rangun Jubatic Tongba is the Gata de la Rangun Jubadisha, the Tongba is and Tenjubi Sherwa. Na Umar Rangi Bekala or Senda. Le Nemela Nai Wangi Shaba Mimba Yurangu Wene Tumong on the Juba, Delusion on the Juba Sure. Just then they got that as or called Che Conditioner Lui Pa Shaba, Le Nemes, Le Nemela Nai Wangi Shaba Janja Mato, Le Nemela Nai Wangi Mashaba, Kaya Marella or that. That didn't you ask Cavalier? Ten you be Galasna, Che Conditioner, Le Nemes says Kishigoma, Lui Wangi Shaba Janja Mato. Lu Pa Mashaba, Cheka, your Marese or Tenubi. That Delia Rangibi, Lu Wangi Shaba said Delia, never Cargas, Lu Numigi Wangi Shaba, never Mebas, Lu never Mebas, Lo Chasa Marella, Lu Wangi Shaba, and Lo Chasa Mare, Delia, Lu never Mebas Lagores, Chesa Lu never Meba, Nayo Wangi Shaba Shemado, Lu never Mebal, Nayo Wangi Shaba Mayin Bigi, Cheka, your Marese or that.
This text is written from the perspective of the Prasangika, hence so many times we've heard the view of the Prasangika, which is that all phenomena, without exception, are empty of existing by way of their own nature, inherent existence, essence, or defining characteristics. Here in the first bullet point, though, is the other division of the Madhyamaka. So Prasangika Madhyamaka, and this point is about the second division, the Svatantika Madhyamaka. And their view is very similar, but slightly different. So reading the first sentence again, in this bullet point, the Svatantika Madhyamika Bhavavivyeka and his spiritual sons use reasoning to refute that phenomena, firstly, exist from the point of view of their own unique way of existing, and, secondly, without being posited due to appearing to a faultless awareness. So where the difference comes between these two Madhyamaka schools let's look at this second point first, without being posited due to appearing to a faultless awareness. Both Madhyamaka schools agree that phenomena need to be imputed by mind and need to appear to awareness. The difference comes is that Prasangika make no reference to the consciousness or the awareness needing to be faultless or not, mistaken or unmistaken. But the Svatantika make explicit reference to the consciousness needing to be faultless or unmistaken. So the differentiation in the second point is the Svatantika, the autonomous school, include the statement that phenomena need to appear to a faultless awareness in order to exist, whereas Prasangika make no reference to whether the consciousness is faultless or unmistaken or not.
Lo numela now check lo numela now wangi shaba mayemba yu korong ngone drupje bachela temba drupa like yes or lo numela now wangi shaba mayemba yu korong ngone drupje kenchi yo mana ner dele temba drupa like yes lo numela now wangi shaba mayemba yu korong ngone drupa 대지 tenjuba de jiba tenju begar서 chekan 류파 샤바 마도 류 샤바 마떼바 뭐랑 그런 거는 주바 라이거와 디나신다 콜로니메 세디다 로니메라 샤다 고트랑이 비 류니메라 나이 원기 샤바레스 류니메라 나이 왜 샤바 마임바 유 그런 거는 주바 지여바이나 디 템바 주바레스 제가 나눠줄래 나요도 데니스 난거레스 디 나와는 여러에서 짐바들이 딘진 라이거레스 워다 라유비기 손나디레 Le numéro c'est de madou qui va y marrer.
The Svatantika say that the presentation of emptiness is that phenomena appear as truly existent, but are empty of true existence. So this is the assertion of Svatantika, and you'll recognize that mere assertion, it would be completely agreed to by the Prasangika. Then, when Svatantika explain what they mean by true existence, he would state the following. A phenomenon appears to exist from its own side to a faultless awareness. This is the appearance of true existence. So I'll say it again. Phenomenon appears to exist from its own side to a faultless awareness. This is the meaning of true existence. This is how phenomena appear, and then a consciousness, grasps at the phenomenon as existing in the way that it appears, and this is the ignorance of true grasping. So that statement is, the Prasangika would agree with every word bar one, that consciousness to which the phenomenon appears as being existent from its own side needs to be faultless. The Prasangika do not use the word faultless, they just say awareness or consciousness or mind. So this is the understanding of true existence for the Svatantika, that a phenomenon appears to exist from its own side to a faultless awareness. And this is the appearance of true existence. And Prasangika would accept that, except for the word faultless.
Umarangi bige karasonde che kanishina korong wene dugu ores yu korong rang wene drupje dan pa del ba lui pa ta pa ni cho ores niga jumana ko ane dan da yue ba cha ores di niga ma sona me ba res ore lo yu korong wene drupje ba che del ba lui pa ta pa ina din yue ba cha ro ores ire 제가 ben에 디스 ore ben에 저기 many bene 가르소래 안도 추진 나봐 다위기 수연치 마셔도 봐이나 아주 many 나의 다와도 있는 거와 나도 베니 로기 어머니 다와시 두 삼바이나 뢰파 다와성원에 베니 다와시 두 삼거 뢰파 떼고 그러지 이네 many 추나래 다와 그런 원에 두벼 말아 요 말와 제가 다와 요 말에 뢰파 따바래도 유코롱 원에 민디 따서 시디 유코롱 원에 마주반자 뢰코로 둘럽는 로디 노수 차서 로셰 차서레스 제가 민디 유디 둘럽하나지 요 말에서 오르다 코롱 원에 마주바레스 제가 뢰파 따바 잠기 여바 차기 말에 제가 유코롱 원에 따서 시디양 코롱 원에 지 두고 그래서 제가 코롱 원에 줍 뢰파 따바네 되네 여바 차로 그래서 Then I was Banahale, tell you, you need go watch your water. You need chill night. Oh, you need Naj. A penny Dawa do las Lepa Tadu, Lepa Dawas Labanashi, Coron Penny go, that's a sheep go, what winner I need you there is. Chazan when you by Sicilia, run when you again, Shichi Yore, Delpa, Dawas Lepa Tabanza, Dawa when you Yoba Chagores. Chazan Lepa Taba, some ye, go Yoba Chagmar. 大是西的人文的主顾的是，就是你错过的是。过大是西的过，陪你这个月份呢，六马大呢，你才买的来。本来俺这个这些的，俺就我学了些垃圾蹦蹦的，我学垃圾，我学 top 差位的，第二呀，过是第一，人事 prime minister 就过俺这个把大家买这把都过才买了。 ko le tago mare ine ko ta san shi di yor de ine le tago mare za ma ta ba za tuan da mo di du yo mare se sa ko shi yo ba ine le pa ma ta na ani cha yo mare pe ne di na ji cha la ji ji sue xiang zhe ge ji de ne ge sue ge ro ge yu ro sue da mo ko ma ta ka ya ji sue sa je de le ming chi de le pa ma ta ba ine shi di ko rong ne du de yor de ine le ma ta ba za di ga re la ne 가시 디갈라고 그래서지 마도 디리랍 투마르와 안디 델 민지 거리요세 파 뢰파 따사위 제라 안디 거리요레 수인다 디거리요라 병으로 거리요 봐 차로 그래 거리요 차로 뢰마다나 거리요 차요 말했어 제가 랑궁원에 주시 따서 시대 랑궁원에 주바이나 뢰마다나 디 원에 거리요 차요 말했어 제가다 뢰 따고래 코롱원에 뢰 따 니가 초바고 그래서 제가 니가 뭐 초바나 데니게 강라 뢰파 따바라 마되바 코롱원에 주여바이네 덴바주바세 차그마도 근데 뭐네 가자를 차로 그래 덴바주바 차로 그래 여바 책이 말이라 제가 코롱랑 뭐네 주여바지 뢰파 마따바지 여바이나 디 덴바주바세들이스 고요 말했어 덴바주바 차고 그래서 데니시라
Let's look then in some more detail at the Svatantika presentation on how phenomena exist. So the Svatantika Madhyamaka, they present that two criteria have to be fulfilled for an object to exist. Both of these criteria, if either is missing, the phenomenon cannot exist. Firstly, the phenomenon needs to exist by way of its own nature, essence, or characteristics. And secondly, it needs to be imputed by mind, labeled by mind. Both of these conditions are required. So we take the illustration we looked at last night of the moon reflecting on a pool of water. The moon appears to our consciousness, and we label, it's the moon. So whilst of those two criteria, the one is fulfilled, mind has labeled moon. The first criteria, the phenomenon needs to exist by way of its own nature or essence, is not fulfilled, because that is a reflection. It's not the actual moon. It does not, so therefore, the object does not possess the essence, nature, or characteristics of the moon, and therefore it is unsuitable to be labeled moon. It cannot be established as the moon. Whereas, should we then look up into the night sky, and we see this bright orb in the sky, and we say, no, that's actually the moon. So here, again, that second characteristic is fulfilled, because mind is labeling moon onto the object. But the first characteristic here is also fulfilled, because that object is established by way of the essence, nature or characteristic of the moon. Similarly, if before an election, there will be two hopeful candidates, and the one who is not the Prime Minister is not suitable to be labeled Prime Minister. However, should that person then win the election, even then at the point of winning, if they are labeled Prime Minister, whilst that second characteristic is fulfilled, that they are labeled Prime Minister, that first characteristic is not yet completely fulfilled, in that they need to be sworn in, etc. But when that is done, then the person is suitable to be labeled Prime Minister because their characteristic has been fulfilled. Likewise, with a cup, if someone has created this object, it is the required basis, it has the essence, the nature of a cup, but it has not yet been labeled, it is not yet suitable, it is not yet a cup. Both need to come together. Or if one just has the thought, the plan to make the cup, but one hasn't created the basis yet, still it is missing. So both of these are required. The object needs to exist by way of its own nature, and it needs to be imputed by mind. If either of these is missing, it cannot be said to be existent. And if the phenomenon appears to exist from its own side, not requiring labeling, that is the appearance of true existence. And that is how phenomena appear. So phenomena appear to us as being self-existent and not requiring labeling. Phenomena seem to exist in the way they appear, as being independent of requiring labeling. And that is the appearance of true existence. Whereas phenomena do exist by way of their own nature, but they also require labeling. So both of those characteristics are required for a phenomenon to exist. So again, because it was summarized in the last bit, I'll repeat that. Phenomena appear as if existing from their own side, and therefore not requiring labeling, seeming to be independent of the requirements of labeling. This is the appearance of true existence. But when one realizes that a phenomenon is empty of true existence, one is realizing that a phenomenon needs to be established by way of its own nature, and it needs to be labeled by mind. So that is the view of the Svatantika Madhyamaka.
And now that Umarangi Bigi Garasina Kachadi, Tempatuba said the Kanishlegri Labdu, Lunimela Nai, Wangi Pa Shapa, Mayemba, Yukorong, when it can to do Vachi, you tell her Tempatuba like the Esere. That the Nigi Dubik Tomba Sedilla, and Tomba is serious. Lunimela Nai, Shapa, Rang when you Dubik Tomba della, Tomba like this. She's not Tomba like this at this order. Look, Chesan Chuk and is around when you look at Numela, Wangi Shabama, round when you typical Tombadi, Tombani said, De Topi Lotilla, Tombani to law, said it.
Svatantika, the autonomous Middle Way school, they hold that phenomena do not exist truly, but they do exist by way of their own nature. So phenomena appear as existing by the way of their own nature, but not requiring labeling. This is how all phenomena appear to consciousness. And this is the appearance of true existence, because it appears that the phenomenon exists truly from its own side, but not requiring labeling. When one realizes that a phenomenon is empty of existing in this way, by way of its own nature, and not requiring labeling, one realizes emptiness, because the way phenomena do exist is by the way of their own nature, but also requiring labeling by mind.
lo nime se di carre se di lo nime la lo ma chu le ko lo ma chu nime se di ne ba me ba se ni kyun me ba se ro ga no mi di a de kyun me ba se lo ma lo kyun me ba se lo la chu shi chu na lo di kyun yo ba se lo di ma chu wa ne kyun me ba se ko je sa lo nime se di lo kyun me ba se le ko ta kyun me ba se carre le kyun me ba se yo ra da ne ko lo di ma chu wa le la di yu ka ne ma chu wa le se li ko ra ma chu ba ne yu ka le ma chu wa le la di 최 간이신 나는 로레 나는 랑원의 주바 nen고레스 랑원의 나와 나신 돈달 랑원의 주디어레 제가 로디 랑원의 주베 나와들 맞추어 하세요. 다돈 로니메사디 유디 나의 랑원의 주바 nen고레스 제가 랑원의 주바들 맞추어 하래서 랑원의 주바 나와 나신 돈을 여바 있는 맞추어 봐. 랑문에 주바라고 다데 nengo래 나와 나신 돈달라 랑문에 주바래 되어레스 진짜 랑문에 주바 나요 로디 랑문에 주바 나와들 추와 말레스 코로나 나와 나시 요레스 로디 추와 말레스 네바 메발라기도 와 진짜 네바 유메스 출마취세 네바 메바는 추와 마추와시고 가래라 마추와래라는 랑문에 주바 나와들 마추와래도 랑문의 주바 베네 아즈글리 미니 가소레 간도 데지셰바나지 춘날마 다와쇼 다위숭연쇼로와 디나의 다와 나신 다와 난거로와 다와 나와들 추데로와 다와 나와 나신 돈달라 다와 마로와 이제 그 다와 나와를 추와래지 야 바나가라 딴데 다와 난거로와 나와 나 다와 나와를 추요 마로와 그래서 다와 나와 나신 다와 요로와 진짜 다와 나와를 맞추와래지 메니 다와 취나라데 다와 nen고라 나와나신 다와 마로와 취나래 제가 다와 나와를 추와레스 취나라 다와 두스 미기 셰바 저로와 디 다와 나와라 추와레스 고 나와나신 다와도 요 마로 메니 취나라 제가 디 취시레스 메니 바나라 다와원을 따여도 나와나신 이니 다와도 요데 봐서 다와를 추요 마레스 취나라 다와 나와 나시미니 다와 요마르 문에 요마르 메바자 다와 나와들 추와레스 코니가라 다와 나와 임바 집하는 거래 이네 직 다와 난 거래 이네 직디 추와레 직디 마 추와레스 다와 나와라 디나신 비디나신 아즈르 유가른 나와나 랑문에 주바는 거로 베네 랑문에 주바 나와 제가 다와데 나와도 랑문에 주바는 거래 나와 나신 아니 나와데 로디 미기 셰바데 다와 랑문의 주바 나와를 추월에 맞추월에는 맞추월에스 제가 다와 랑문들 나와 나시 그런 다와 그런 랑문의 주바래 이제 맞추월에스 그래 제가 르네메세 유가린 난기네 분발로 소바다 가와신라 가린 난기네 그 랑문의 주바 nen고레스 나와 나신 돈달라 랑문의 주바래 되어레스 이제 랑문의 주베 나와라 맞추월에스 제가 데니치로 르네메라 그래서 랑지베
The term faultless awareness, so awareness or consciousness is we can use either term. Faultless, usually we use unmistaken. So faultless awareness, unmistaken consciousness. What makes this consciousness mistaken or unmistaken is, according to the Svatantika, whether the object exists in the way that it appears or not. If the object exists in the way that it appears, that consciousness is unmistaken. If the object does not exist in the way that it appears, it is a mistaken awareness. To give an illustration, when you look at the moon, the way the object appears is how it exists, as established by way of its own side. Therefore, that is a faultless awareness, an unmistaken consciousness. But the consciousness to which the reflection of the moon appears as being the moon, the object does not exist in the way that it appears, and therefore that consciousness is faulty or mistaken. So therefore the dividing line between whether consciousness or an awareness is faultless or not is whether the object appears in a way that it exists or not. A moon exists in the way that it appears, Therefore, the apprehending or the consciousness to which it appears is faultless, but a reflection appearing as the moon, it does not exist in the way that it appears, and therefore that consciousness is mistaken. Let's look a little at the difference between these two Middle Way schools, the Prasangika and the Svachantika. They both agree that for an object to exist, it requires labeling by mind. And therefore, that object that is labeled or imputed or designated upon is the basis for labeling or imputation or designation. So there is agreement. So for example, this table is labeled, needs to be labeled by mind, and the basis for labeling by mind is this table. Agreement thus far. The disagreement is how the table exists. The Svachantika say that table exists from its own side, by way of its own nature or essence. The table exists from its own side. Prasangika will say it does not. It does not exist from its own side or by way of its own nature or essence. So how the basis of labeling exists is where the disagreement lies.
Na dadelia benenga jugi choksa siming dasa shijiorwa dir umarangi be rangongene jubare set umatengi be rangone madubare la 제가 오늘 tenjuba 가서 랑원에 마두바 라고래 랑원에 줍랍나 규단 견라 마두바 깨와래 라고래스 제가 규단 견라 되는 깨와서 규단 견디 쪽도 코롱기 따서 시딜에 셴을 와서 제가 셴기 견지는 거 깨와서 셴을 떼고래 셴을 떼봐서 랑왕 말해스 제가 랑왕 세도 셴지라 마두바라 끼시고래 제가 셴 랑왕 랍나 셴지라 마두라 떼봐요 마두바를 라고래스 제가 그 규단 견을 되는 얘기도 와 셴을 떼기도 와 제가 랑왕 말해스 랑왕 깨요 말해스 제가 따서 시디 랑왕 죽여 말해스 그래서 그 랑왕도 죽여 말해 그래서 규단 견 셴을 떼기도 와 셴을 떼봐나 랑라 셴을 떼봐당 랑왕이 돼 가버려스 제가 셴을 떼봐나 랑왕 말해스 시고다 tenjubilata de rawando me set kimsen ro disungore 제가 쪽에서 민다서 희주여와 그 랑왕 말해 랑왕도 맞게 말했어 그래서 유견 현실에 되는 기어로 와서 제가 벤당을 부고를 샤샤네로 부고 그런 게에 랑왕 게와 말했어 그 아마래 되는 유단 견래 되는 게와랬어 제가 유단 견 현실에 되는 부고 그런래 현 유단 견래 되는 게와자 그 랑왕 게와 말했어 벤능아 밀을 채우라 벤능아 저게 파수 조마도 소수 조마도 미로버티원에 소소 랑왕 조투고 말 현래 땡고 그래서 우리가 현래 땡고 그래 마도 랑왕교 말스 제가 현래 땡바다 랑왕이디 가와레스 랑왕세네 와치 차산 랑을 왜 현래 땡 먹고 받을 고고레스 제가 현래 땡네 게 거기에 유단 견 현실로 떼고고요 봐나 유단 견의原来거 기고래 유단 견의 맨날 거 기고 말 제가 거기에 맞게서 유단 견을 라래고 와 제가 유단 견을 라래 봐서 유단 견을 떼바래 제가 그런 랑왕요 말에 그 유단 견을 떼네 게 맞게 맞도 그 랑왕 게 말고 유하고 맞게네 랑왕 게 와서는 게 돼요 말에 제가 랑왕요 말에 제가 랑왕 게세다 현을 떼네 게세 이 가와래스 제가 랑왕도 요르세 랩교마 랑왕도 요말 그래서 차산 현을 떼네 요르에서 텐주비서야 돼 랑왕 요 말에서 돼 현을 떼비 김생게 랑왕 요 말에서 송거래
As just mentioned, the two Madhyamaka schools will agree that a particular basis of labeling is required for mind to label onto it. So if we take firstly the illustration of this table, it would be the basis of labeling. So there's agreement. The disagreement is that Svatantika say this table is self-existent, or it exists by way of its own nature, essence, or characteristics, and Prasangika would say no, it's empty of existing in this way. And why do the Prasangika say this? How do they say that? How is it that they say the table is empty of existing by way of its own nature? They say it is not, and I'll use synonyms here, it is not independent, has no freedom, it is not under its own power. So these three we can understand as, these three are synonymous. Under its own power, being free, or being independent. So I'll use, as the translator, I'll use under its own power because it will be clearer in the illustration. So this table, Prasangika say, is not under its own power. It is under the power of things other than itself, namely its causes. So too with a child. A child is not under its own power, didn't come into existence under its own power, but independence on causes, its mother. So therefore, this phenomenon it has no freedom, it is not independent, it is not under its own power, because it is under the power or influence of other, namely causes. Therefore, the table is not established by way of its own essence, nature, or characteristics. It's not existent from its own side. That would, if it were so, it would be under its own power. But it is not. It is established independence on namely causes. So that is the view of the Prasangika. They say the table, the child, etc., is not under its own power. Therefore, it is not self-existent or established by way of its own essence or nature, cannot be established by way of its own essence or nature or characteristics, because it is under the power of something or the influence of something other than itself, namely causes. So this is why Prasangika say that all phenomena, such as this table, are empty of inherent existence.
다 우마랑지 비기 가르스네 다 랑와 코 규단 견레드니 기고르도 코는 랑궁원에 기고르 랑원에 줍디요르 사지 고 랑궁원에 여바네 매바 랑원에 매네 매바 차로 그래서 그래 디제 디니 인자 안데 우마랑지 비 가르스네 타니도 세와다 찌텔이야 타니도 랑이 칭이 남 랑궁원에 줍바 샤기시 세데 타니도 랑이 칭이 남 모니 줍바 샤기시 세데 제자 데데 텐주비 우마랑지 비기 제자다 ko gyudan kyen le dine gi go re ine korang ko rang sang gi drupa re rang ne drupa re sa chi
In the immediately preceding segment I presented the Prasangika view on how the basis of labeling exists. Svatantika, though, now returning to the text, they assert, though, however, they asserted, Svatantika assert, existence through their own particular characteristics or own essence conventionally. So this is how Prasangika say phenomena do exist, under their own power, that they have freedom or independence. They exist under their own power. So Svatantika certainly accept that phenomena such as this table came about in dependence on causes. Nevertheless, it exists under its own power. Otherwise, it would not exist. Otherwise, it would not exist. So therefore, the meaning of this line, they assert that phenomena exist through their own particular characteristics or essence, is that in addition to coming about in dependence on causes, the phenomenon also exists under its own power, by way of its own nature. Otherwise, it would not exist.
Rangyubi shetan diya anda jiksolya lolya ha jik ha goya dus lolya devarash majungwa chidu ane mishon dige semzamba gar sorze mishon we na ane semzamba lobi yin so yi chidun ribi go jing sem ane denrup de shaki she sede deji rangyubi garsan chue tamje demba majuba le la ro chisan demba majuba res yine rangwen de juba res ye ro da chue tamje demba majubare uma rangiba chue tamje demba majubare ina rangongon jubare sen kishigruwa 제자다 샘잠베게 덴바 마주바레스에 샤투고 말제다 차사 최 탐제 덴바 마주바레스에 켈레레 갈레 하고 지고래 데네 자 로베 인연로 수베게 아니 치든 리뷰고 아세데 치르게 된 주바요 말레스 샘 거로 덴바 주바레스네 아니 샘잠베 디켈링 거래제 치든 덴바 마주바레 치든 요 말에 치든 세도 요 말와 덴바 마주바레 치든 세도 요 말레스 지 바가 데네 치르게 된 세도 요 말에 이내 샘 거로 덴바 주바레스
For those who aren't ready for the subtlety of the Svatantika view, the Chittamatan view was taught and may well be more suitable for them. So looking then at the second bullet point on page 17. For those whose minds could not cope even with such a lack of true existence, Chittamatan teachers such as Vasubandhu used reasoning to refute external objects, yet asserted that the mind does exist truly. Here, a great distinction, or an important distinction between the Chittamatans and Svatantikas is presented, or even the Chittamatans and the Madhyamakas. The Madhyamakas say, all phenomena are empty of true existence. Svatantika, though, say, not only, whilst all phenomena are empty of true existence, they do exist inherently. But for those who ascribe to the Chittamatan view, they would do so because they would see that view as being too far, that phenomena, whilst existing inherently, are empty of true existence. So the Chittamatan view, it refutes external objects, so external objects do not exist truly, but the mind does exist truly.
지나다 소소라서버 치료용 원년 주바디 다 최기 다도 주바세 최기 다도 주바 다 덴버 주바세다 디 비슷한 거만 최기 다도 주바세 그래 치료 소소라서버 치료용 원년 주바들라 치료 된도 주바다 최기 다도 주바 치료용 원년 주드바 주바나디 최기 다도 주바레스 아니 대 최기 치료용 원년 소소라서버 치료용 원년 주바 매반자 소소게 최간지네 치료원은 주바디가 똥바레스. 치료원은 주바 똥바데라 아니 최기 담에서 똥바니 있어. 최기 담에서 들라 그래지. 디 똑배가 로데라 똥바니 똑로. 최기 담에 똑로시 그래서. 나디 곰발에 되네 아니 나 사기 고바 토야게 녀모 빠야게 님보 쪼고 디레스 뭐라. 녀모 뭐 님보 쪼 매바서야게 님보 디레스 오다 안 주게. 최근에 수소라서 최디게 나도 나는 그라 덴버드버서 치료 된도 주바는 거래지 치료 된도 주바는 거래 치료 용원을 주바 낭sem라 마되바 치료 용원을 주바는 거래지 다 낭sem라 마되바 치료 용원을 주바 요래베스는 요 말이에스 제사디 매바자 낭sem라 마 치료 용원을 주바디 덴버드바 가서 취기 다도 주바셔야 돼 치료 된도 주바래나 취기 다도 주바라기래스 데니게 나 셈게 라마도랑 치료용원에 주바 나와 나신 동바디 아니 취기 담에서 그래서 데도 불르기 러들라 동바이 또 불러다 취기 담에 또 불러라 그래야지 That's the said the Ming Dama Kishoma, you know the children wanted to Nangur, now and as you message.
The Chittamatrans hold, the mind-only school hold that external phenomena do not exist. And when one realizes this, one realizes the selflessness of phenomena. Because phenomena appear to our mind as being externally established. And then we grasp at them as being externally established. But this is not how they exist. And when one realizes that external phenomena do not exist in the way they appear, they are not externally established, then one realizes the selflessness of persons. And the selflessness of persons is the realization of emptiness for the Chittamatrans, and it is the primary, did I say selflessness of persons? Maybe. The selflessness of phenomena. We're only talking about selflessness of phenomena. The realization of the selflessness of phenomena, that phenomena are not externally established despite appearing as such, and the way they appear is being externally established. They require no engagement or interaction with consciousness. When one realizes that phenomena are empty of being externally established, that is the wisdom realizing emptiness. It's called the selflessness of phenomena, and it is the primary antidote to the afflictions, and it is the wisdom that leads to enlightenment. So all phenomena, all external phenomena appear to us as being externally established, and without requiring any engagement by mind. When one realizes that phenomena are empty of being externally established, one realizes the selflessness of phenomena, and that selflessness of phenomena is the wisdom realizing emptiness and the primary antidote to all afflictions, and leads to enlightenment being attained.
Semge danyi re so semge danyi semge danyi semna ngoji pare semge danyi re jisan semle ngoji ba danyi ji ba ngoji ba se jorwa ngoji ba nina se de le na su shi ro jisan chirugu suso la so che kane shi ne semge ngore semge danyi res nandu kabla semla madyoba khorong wene pasho semla madyoba khorong semle ngo tadebaru nango res dene nawa na shinji yorbelane dene nawa de yo mar che susolab che kan shine ko semge danyi zamre de semge ngo zamre de res jiza dene yeza semge ngo zamre res 디신 콜마도 셈용오레 마도 셈이파 따바레세 기시고 마데 셈용오 점레세 디시고레.
Phenomena appear to us as being externally established, but in the Chittamatran presentation, they don't talk about imputation by mind. But what they say is what one needs to come to recognize, that phenomena are not externally, or external phenomena are not externally established, rather they are in the mere nature of mind. They appear as being separate from mind, as unrelated to mind, but actually they are in the mere nature of mind.
아니래. 대전다 수소라서 베치에게 나이도 셈령 오 타데바 셈게 다니 오 타데바 나와나시 메바레세. 제사 셈 치르기 수소라서 봐 나와나시 모인이서 말에 템바 주바레세 책으로. 치르기 수소라서 봐 나이도 셈령 오 타데바 는 거레스. 나와나시 셈령 오 타데바. 치르기 수디 뭐 찍바다 타데바세죠. 뭐 찍바 많이 타데는 뭐 찍바 많이 봐서 그러와. 제가 뭐 타디 받는 거 나와나시 요 말레스 나와나시 대바 마주 바레스 뭐이네서 말레스 제가 뭐지 바레스 어두시 셈 고롱 아니 대바 주 바레스 셈 고롱 셈 용어 셈 고롱 셈 용어 타디 받는 거 말와 제가 셈 고롱 대바 주 바레스 제가 돈달라 치르기 수소로 소바 대바 마주 바레 치르도는 마주 바레스 셈 고롱 대바 주 바레스 시고래 demba drupare dan dela nangsun de so ki shiyo da demba drupare saji sem khorong sem ngo thaje ban phinang me yirwa nang yo mare
as we see here in the text, Vasubandhu used reasoning to refute external objects, yet asserted that the mind does exist truly. So the Chittamatrans hold that phenomena appear to us as being externally established, but this is not how they exist. So they're appearing to us as being externally established, unrelated to mind. This is the appearance of true existence. And this is not in accordance with reality. This is not how phenomena exist. They are not separate or unrelated from mind. So that's the first part of the text, refuting external objects. However, mind, this does exist truly, and that then is the second part. So external phenomena other than mind do not exist truly, but mind does.
Da chugi dame gi nudo magyurba la sa dema jedo ni gi dongyi ge de kansa rangye tubi zeso mebe da meba zam shi shes da de ko jera mawadan de ba de gi dongyi se de gaso chugi dame se de kelin go nudo magyurba se chugi dame kelin tugo mares 마두반 장콘주기 동반이 세계 잡라 가르디고서는 가사 랑게 투비 즈즈투비 동화세데 켈린 거래 예전에 랑게 투비 즈즈투비 동바세데
And for those practitioners for whom the Chittamatran view is also too difficult to grasp, they would be more comfortable with that asserted by the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika. So here we come then to the third bullet point. For those who could not be recipients for a teaching of the selflessness of phenomena, the proponents of truly existent external objects, the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika, asserted mere selflessness in the place of emptiness, which is the person not existing as a self-sufficient, substantial existent. So firstly, what we see is that those who hold the views of the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika do not accept the selflessness of phenomena. They don't discuss this at all. They also don't discuss, because they hold, as it goes on, that phenomena, external phenomena, are truly existent. And they also don't talk about emptiness, but assert only selflessness of persons. So that's the meaning of asserted mere selflessness in the place of emptiness. They do not even discuss the term emptiness, but rather investigate and have a view on the selflessness of persons. And the selflessness of persons is the last term, self being empty of being self-sufficient, substantially existent. That realization is the realization of selflessness, and in particular, the selflessness of persons.
Zanda kansa rangya tubi jesu drupa se dile dan kansa tatu drupa la kansa rangya tubi jesu drupa la de ngazo kansa se de ngazo nga se de se kansa sigro nga se kansa se di phumbo da phumbo cheshe la ma de ba ji drup ba ina kansa che ba ne dile kansa rangya tubi jesu drupa rangya tuba se rangya tuba la de shen ji le de mo go ba korong ne tuwi na rangya tuba se 데니기 제수 주발에 데니 응고보세요. 그러고 제를 응고발에. 제가 강사 세디 풍보라 마도 풍보다 풍보 체실라 마도 바저 그런 네 투경기 지기바이나 여바는 데라 간사랑 유튜브가 되게des. 데네 간사 요 말해서. 지산 데니게 간사 풍보당 풍비게 차실라 마줘봐. 코롱 원에 주랑 원에게 다 주바지. 데니게 줍되게 떼 먹어 봐지 간사 줘봐이나 디 간사랑 유튜브하세요. 디 요래서 비 진비로디 간사랑 유튜브 진비 진바세데. 아주 뇽몽바 깨기. 다 규조어 디레세오다. 제가 뭐 되게 봐. 다디 매바서야 될 간사 강라이마도 랑원이 주베 동바디 간사 랑이 지주베 동바세 간사 다메를 거레스 데 동바도 별로디 아니 가서리 간사 다메도 별로레스 디 곰발레 때네 랑이 주베 지주베 지비게 뇽몽게 예게 규리 디 방고 데니스 방고 그래야지 나 검자 탈도디 디레스 디심무슨 거래 랑게 투바라나 풍보다 풍비게 차실라 마도 호롱 문이 예 호롱 줍디 바질라 간사세 데니지 간사 예바네 간사 랑게 투바라 그래스 지나 풍보라 마도 바죠 말아서 간사 풍볼 뛰고 풍보 대샤시나 간사 바시 좋아지요 말아 지나 간사 랑게 투바라네 풍보라 마도 바 풍보다 풍비 차실라 마도 바 호롱 문이 줍디게 간사 예바네 데라 간사 랑게 투바라 그래스 대진별로데 다신 디 동화디 가사 다메 디 동화도 별로 되라 다메도 별로 써야지
What is this view then of a self being self-sufficient, substantially existent? This, according to the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika, is how the self appears to us as being self-sufficient, substantially existent, and our ignorance grasps at the self as existing in the way that it appears. And that is the ignorance of self-grasping. So the self that is grasped at by ignorance is grasped at as existing in the way that it appears, which is as being self-sufficient, substantially existent. And so what does that mean then? So what it means is that the self appears as if it were independent of the aggregates. That it exists by way of its own substance or essence, and as if it were self-existent. So it appears as if it is self-existent, existing by way of its own substance, and therefore independent of the aggregates. But that is not how the self exists. Nevertheless, it appears in this way. Our ignorance grasps at the self as existing in this way, the ignorance of self-grasping, and from this, all the afflictions arise. So therefore, to eradicate this ignorance of self-grasping, grasping at the self as being self-existent and existing by way of its own substance or essence, one needs to realize that the self is empty of being self-sufficient, substantially existent. That is the realization of selflessness. And they would just use the term selflessness. But for the higher schools, who also talk about the selflessness of phenomena, they would say that this realization is the realization of the selflessness of persons for the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika.
가서 뇽몽바게기 방비 림바들레 잠니제 janjusimla so komne da nyomongbe zawade denzen marik dasen marik ba pae nyembo gome de zo de da de dumdai shi ge dawa midawa shi che gorwa dene zada on rangyu bede de jeramo de pala so ko dawa zo de karsine dame ba ser kansa rangyu de bisu de tonwa se de ndi kombale de nyomongba cha pango re sa 지산 디네시고 지산 가사 세디 다 랑게 투비 제주주바 요마레 세지 가르스네 랑게 투바 제주주바 죄나 가서 풍보라 마덴 바치 요구리 풍보라 마덴 베게 가서 가 세디 자야 요마레 세지 또 순고로 봐 언디네 지산데 언디
So what we've seen in these bullet points, as well as what is the non-prasangika Buddhist tenets, presentation of the self, And previously, we've heard about the Prasangika presentation, and I've included that here. So why is there such discussion about how the self exists? Well, it is because all Buddhists agree that our suffering comes from an ignorance of grasping at the self in a way that it doesn't exist. In other words, ignorance of self-grasping. So this ignorance of self-grasping, all Buddhists agree, is the root cause that keeps us bound in the suffering realms of samsara. So therefore, that is what needs to be eradicated by wisdom. The discussion is not up to that point. There's agreement. But how does the self appear? How does it exist? There is where the discussion arises. Because that understanding of how the self appears and how it exists is what leads to the correct or a mistaken consciousness realizing or not realizing emptiness. So therefore they have a different understanding of what is the wisdom that realizes emptiness of the self as not existing in the way that it appears because of their different understanding of the self. So for example, the Vaibhashika and Sarchantikas hold that the self is empty of being self-sufficient, substantially existent, because if it were so, if it did exist in the way that it appears, it would be independent of the aggregates, but no such self exists.
And the same thing with Tawad Howard, the Besh Lela, which Lela Chagore. The dinner do sometimes same thing with Tawadi, Jeb, sometimes the cat, Jotati, Yahuasobana, dinner Rangi Big Tawadi, let Doyalia, Hawel, Lela Chagore, Lelo. Then Rangi Big Tawadi, Yahuawana, didn't think you with Tawad, Hawel, but Tiny Woolly, which is a Lela Chagore, which is a dinner, on the Desul Masona, Kenzanashi, Kenzegi, one at Zadwach, or Dinashi, research.
For those who have the opportunity to come to understand these various Buddhist tenets well, there's great benefit. The Buddha taught them for so many specific reasons. And if those who have the opportunity to understand the Vaibhashika and Sarchantika well, their view well, it's much easier for them to gain a deep and thorough understanding of the Chittamatan view. And in dependence on understanding and reflecting well on the Chittamatan view, the Madhyamaka Svachantika view becomes much easier to understand. And with that understood well, the view of the Prasangika can also be understood more easily and more profoundly. So therefore, these have been presented or differentiated in a way that one can come to understand them sequentially, as if one is progressing or climbing a ladder leading to the final view, the view of actual reality.
And then that you go to the Shashan and go that in my then you will motivate my shoes. Then to worry you're not done by that.
Our time is nearly up for this morning, so we'll leave it there, starting with the fourth bullet point this afternoon. If you have some questions, then please feel free to ask. And thank you, and it's time for lunch, so enjoy your lunch.